Welcome to this podcast, Your Places or Mine, abbreviated to YPOMPod, with me, John Goodall, the architectural editor of Country Life.
And me, Clive Aslett, publisher of Triglyph Books.
So, Clive, what are we going to be talking about this week?
Well, we're going to be talking about something which is very exciting to me, John, because the subject is Castle Howard, which has just been sort of completely revamped. And you have seen it, and I'm dying to hear, because I haven't.
Indeed. Well, I was very generously entertained for the opening of the rooms at Castle Howard, and we thought that this episode would tie together two themes. One of them is the 300th anniversary of the death of Sir John Vanbrugh, who's the architect involved, which is going to be next year, and there are lots of plans, I know, to celebrate that. But also this relaunch, really, of the interior of Castle Howard and the spectacular reworking that's been undertaken by the present generation of the Howard custodians of the property. It's a wonderful undertaking.
And I think that Vanbrugh is such a fantastic character that he's really got to be a series in his own right before very long. But let's start with Castle Howard.
Indeed, we will certainly be doing more individual buildings of his, won't we? I mean, the story of... I mean, we thought we'd, divide this obviously into two parts, and that we would think about the representation in the second part, and the first part really just to talk about the house and John Vanbrugh's own career, which, as Clive says, we'll certainly be revisiting. I mean, he's a very fascinating figure, Sir John Vanbrugh, and in fact he leaps into focus in the architectural historical world through Castle Howard. Because, I mean, there's been a great deal written recently about Vanbrugh and his early life, but he definitely isn't, by the terms of his early life, very obviously a major architect in training.
No, I think you can certainly say that. But of course that was true of many architecture. The concept of architect hadn't really emerged.
No, and I suppose in some ways, he begins his career, as far as we can trace it, as a soldier, doesn't he? And that's often a way in which people travel and see the world.
He has some bad luck.
And and is amazingly imprisoned in, amongst other places, Vincennes, the great...
people used to say the Bastille, but whether or not that is true, that might just be a myth.
No, I think it is Vincennes, and it's this extraordinary...
Of course, he has this rather dodgy name. Oh. Which is Flemish.
Yes.
And so he claims, I think that at that time he was arrested on suspicion of being Flemish. It would have been okay if he'd been... I don't think we were actually at war with France at the time, but it was because of his Flemish name.
Gosh,
is that right?
I don't. That's very... It's interesting. But of course...
We'll look it up.
This is exactly... this is, of course, the period of Louis XIV's wars all over Europe, when England Britain pretty consistently finds itself
and I think we don't quite know when he was, quotes, imprisoned. We don't quite know what he did, because imprisonment, of course, in those days didn't actually mean you were literally inside a prison if you gave your parole. And so it would have been an opportunity for him to get around Paris and see what was going on.
Indeed, and we think that it has been suggested that one of the benefits of his imprisonment was a love of the theatre, which is his second profession, which, after having been a soldier, Captain Vanbrugh goes off and becomes a playwright.
Possibly also, a love of domes.
Indeed, of course. No. Well, it's sort of this very varied career, and then quite suddenly, in a letter which is memorably dated Christmas Day, 1699, he says that he's involved in building a new house for the Earl of Carlisle, the third Earl of Carlisle, in a place called Henderskelth in Yorkshire, which, as we now know as Castle Howard. Completely extraordinary.
Yes. I suppose we ought to sketch a bit of a picture of him in London, because it explains how he knew this grandee, or somebody who sort of wasn't quite so much a grandee as one might imagine, from his house. But of course Vanbrugh was a spectacularly successful playwright. He also owned theatres, so they brought in a lot of money. I think they burnt down...
he built one of his own.
But did it burn down, John? I think they didn't last very long. That was always the way with theatres. But of course, when they were standing, they brought in a lot of money. He was a herald, and he was also a member of the Kit Kat Club. And the Kit-Kat Club was a sort of collection of aristocrats, essentially, and principally it was a gaming club. But there were also artists and literary people. Was that right, John?
That's right, and its sympathies are unequivocally Whig, which means sort of...
So it's on the right side... From a political and economic point of view.
Well, it's on the Whigs as opposed to Whigs as opposed to Tories. The Whigs being, those who wish to see a constitutional monarchy, and who, of course, are victorious through the Glorious Revolution of 1688. I mean, the William III is hugely important in Vanbrugh's. In the Earl of Carlisle's political career.
Of course, Queen Anne hoving into view, who was not of Whiggish sympathies.
Indeed, who was Tory in sympathy, but
But I suppose we should just comment on this enormous number of country houses. These huge, they're palaces, really, that were begun round. It wasn't just because of the Glorious Revolution, as it used to be called, which brought in William III married to Queen Mary. But it began slightly before. I think Chatsworth was begun slightly before 1688, wasn't it, John?
Well, Chatsworth exists before 1688, but I think it's grand remodelling by Talman. Now, here, yes, we're going to...
I think it was just before. I think that there was something very much in the air. Anyway, when the Glorious Revolution happened and Britain became this constitutional monarchy, these great landowners... and also people who did extremely well out of the new government, suddenly they were full of confidence, spectacular confidence.
Yes, I think we need to put it even more strongly than that, don't you? I mean, basically the Glorious Revolution is brought about by a group of people for their own benefit. And it's glorious because they do extremely well out of it. I mean, it has all kinds of other political ramifications, but it is, the Duke of Devonshire is one of those who does extraordinarily well out of it. And
I suppose it's a symbol of this kind of constitutional monarchy in that while it was not in our terms democratic, it was no longer monarchical. Things were no longer run by one person, the king. It was this group of very, very grand aristocrats who became even grander and vastly richer.
Indeed,
and they could all build these big
and the
houses.
Terms of the invitation to William III are that that he's not Catholic and that there are restrictions to royal power. I mean, obviously, William and Mary both reign together until Mary dies, and then William reigns alone. But I mean, that there is that sense that this is the Whigs actually winning a political victory. They've reformulated the monarchy and. There is a triumphalism, I think, about this, which coincides, of course, with Britain's own development as a major power, the beginnings of its imperial expansion. They're all taking place at this moment. And to a really weird extent, I think the way that the British begin to see themselves as a second Roman world.
Yes.
Which is expressed again in
Castle Howard.
In Castle Howard and their architecture. I mean, I would say, of course, that Castle Howard, of course, in a bizarre way, is looking both forwards and backwards because it's both classical, but it is still a castle.
Yes, I know, extraordinary, very much emphasised.
It is very much emphasised, and the property that the third Earl, takes over at Henderskelth, it is itself previously a castle. So he's actually taking over something that is a pre-existing castle. I think we have no idea what it looks like. But he's rebuilding it in this form.
Were they thinking that was a Roman fort, or were they thinking it was an immemorial castle?
I think they're thinking of it as an immemorial castle, but the ideas are conflated. I mean, this is an age where people are buried and, with tombs by Rysbrack in which they're dressed as Roman generals. I mean, that these things are conflated.
Yes.
It's worth saying that Blenheim, which we tend to refer to now as a palace, in all its early designs, is Blenheim Castle. And of course, that's being built for this great general, this military figure, the victor of the Battle of Blindheim. That there's an overtone of both this idea of a medieval nobility, i.e., nobility that has a vocation to fight, and therefore they live in castles, which are but also castles are somehow the bones of the kingdom. They're inherited residences, they're great residences, and that they therefore express nobility in architecture And then if you make them classical too, you can conflate everything together. You can be Roman,
Yes.
noble,
Yes.
all these different things all at once.
At Castle Howard, Vanbrugh actually builds mock fortifications.
Well, he does, and of course Giles Worsley wrote really interestingly about this, suggesting that in some ways this huge landscape that surrounds it is partly informed by Roman, actually the walls of Rome with the pyramid. I don't know if you remember in Rome that has this metro station Pyramide for this great classical pyramid. That he suggested that in fact the topography of Rome is being partly copied in this. I mean, it's an interesting idea that. And the outer landscaping and architectural features of Castle Howard are completely extraordinary.
I think another element we must throw into the mix is that William III, don't know about Queen Mary so much, but William III was very, very interested in architecture. And architecture was an incredibly hot subject amongst these rich aristocratic people. And they all went to show their drawings to William III, and it was discussed at court. And so to build a country house made you, just by building it, made you somebody.
I completely agree. And I think it's an important point to make that we spend a lot of time trying to attribute designs in this period when it isn't known exactly who produced them. And I think one of the reasons it's so complicated so often, certainly the next generation of buildings, places such as Houghton, and is that it's a sort of gentlemanly and clubbable activity. I mean, the membership of the Tic Tac Club, you imagine that a lot of these people are sitting down, over their gaming table and drinking away and showing each other plans and designs. And
egging each other on.
And indeed, in what Vanbrugh must have been clubbable. He must have been a clubbable person. And
I think he was a very engaging. He would have been a wonderful person to have as a dinner companion. I think more than any other architect, I'd like to have sat next to Vanbrugh
because he would have been. Well, I mean,
and full all these different interests that he had and witty,
well travelled, and a playwright who could write comedies that people clearly found hilariously funny, and to be engaged in a process of design which is. Almost it sounds pretentious to say, but kind of an enactment of social status, that you're designing a country house and you involve all your other friends in making it really wonderful. Ironically, of course, you imagine that many of the people who helped design these buildings, they all have estates in different parts of the country. It's quite possible they never saw the finished buildings. They only saw the buildings as designs, around the gaming table in London.
You mean they never got there?
Well, I mean,
to have a look.
You do wonder, other members of the Tic Tac Club, would they ever really have travelled to North Yorkshire?
Well, of course, it's the case with Castle Howard and many other buildings that certainly the pace of building in the 18th century was so slow. The buildings weren't finished, and the landscapes certainly weren't finished.
And also
in the lifetime of the people who begun them.
And there's architects such as Robert Adam make a point, and James Gibbs make a point of engraving designs, partly because their patrons build them in ways that they don't approve of, and also because the way in which they can make their designs most widely available is not through travel and people seeing them.
No,
it is through showing them as engravings, and so that sense, it is the Tic Tac Club. You do imagine that in these discussions they're having, it's a genteel, clubbable undertaking.
Distant part of the world, wasn't it, John?
It was all that way away.
Not everybody would know that you come from Yorkshire.
But it's I think it's also worth saying that obviously, Vanbrugh himself and the courtiers are very aware this is the world of Louis XIV. I mean, his star is fading by this time, but he is this dominant figure. And that Versailles is a building that has European recognition and status. What's so interesting about Castle Howard, I think in contrast to that, is that it has this enormous formal landscape with that wonderful lime avenue. Yes. But the lime avenue is not on axis with the building. The avenue is on axis, allows you views across the lake and towards the building. And it seems to me a really fascinating contrast with Versailles, where everything kind of brings you into the person of the king, who is absolutely in his bedchamber, absolutely in the centre of this enormous parkland that brings you in and in and in and in to the inner sanctum. But Castle Howard already reflects interest in formal planning that are kind of aware of that sort of design, but they're already doing something quite different.
Wasn't it because that the building, as we were just saying, took so long that by the end of it, the third Earl of Carlisle, he'd rather moved on to other things. I don't think he was very committed actually to finishing it because it was so expensive and everything. Well, he'd got much more into the landscape. Indeed. So we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves.
We are slightly.
Should we describe the building?
Should we? Well, I think you have to describe the building, don't you, from that approach along that avenue. There is another view of the building from the main York Road, which sort of reveals the whole landscape. But I think that for everybody's experience of it today now is turning off, whether from the York side or from the side of Malton, along this avenue of lime trees, and it's it's a cathedral of nature, and it runs up and down hills quite steeply. And in a car, you whiz along, and then there suddenly come these moments where you get views left or right, depending which way you're going, towards the house. And there's also a long water, a sort of straight formal lake that you cross over on the way there. But it is a road that theoretically takes you straight past Castle Howard. I mean, that's the peculiar thing. And it is visible to one side, and there is that magical moment when it appears, the dome rising high above,
on top of a hill,
with a lake in front.
Yeah, so a very commanding position.
It is like a castle.
And this house, which I can't quite think, I'm trying to avoid a vulgar way of expressing it, but this very large house, but it was meant to be like that, wasn't it? And it's a stunning sight, and of course, it's very facile to say that Vanbrugh, playwright, was a very theatrical architect, and obviously that's a bit of a cliche in architectural historical terms. But nevertheless, it was true. And there's something of stage scenery about it, because the house has a much greater extent than its real volume, because it has wings which go out,
which create a structure of enormous breadth and scale, don't they? And in fact,
enormous forecourt.
And the sort of castellar form of them makes them look slightly like prison blocks. Curiously, the service ranges on either side, and particularly the original one, which is at the far end of the house. I mean, it's a very austerely detailed structure, and the main block of the house is actually very richly ornamented. Yes. And I think it's really important to say that.
But the wings are sort of 1 room deep, aren't they? Or maybe
they are, and then beyond that is the service court at the far side. I mean, on one side
shielded from view,
and on the other side
stables.
And so they do look rather institutional, but they give it an enormous presence and scale.
They also had this is possibly a bit of a footnote, but they were also linked by corridors. Did you know that at Blenheim, Vanbrugh had to write to the Duchess of Marlborough saying that the word to describe these passages, madam, is corridor, a foreign word, which means this long passage. It's interesting because it's not a French word, it's, I think, a Spanish word. But, the corridor was a new thing connecting rooms up, so you didn't have to walk from one end to the other.
To go through rooms in sequence.
Yes.
I mean, they exist before, don't they? But of course, they're not given a formal term. And what's so interesting about Castle Howard and indeed Blenheim is they're given a formality of treatment. They're vistas, like enfilades, aren't they? I mean, they're
really almost the most spectacular thing about the buildings.
But we should talk about in the next
part.
Because they're
very stone. Whether they are actually built out of stone, in fact they are.
They're vaulted.
And so consequently they look very, very Roman.
Well, the other thing I think that's really important to say about Castle Howard is that, of course, when you see it from the outside, it is the first English country house with a monumental dome. That nobody had done this before. And again, I think that's a very sort of Roman-inspired...
Domes are relatively rare at the best of times.
Well, you do get these little miniature ones on earlier houses, often lanterns lighting staircase, cupolas, but they're nothing like...
No.
This has real presence, and it's actually not set over a staircase, which is nearly always what has happened in the earlier 17th century. When a place like Winchester Palace, you get relatively small lanterns sitting over staircases. And you also, of course, in great halls, medievalizing rooms, you get things as at Lambeth, when the 1660s, the sort of louvers. But this is a massive dome. And we'll be talking about this further, but of course, what's really amazing...
So what is it sitting over?
Well, it is sitting over the entrance hall.
Yes.
That is centrally over the entrance hall.
Well, not over the stair, then.
But not over... Yes, the stairs sort of go round the side of it, effectively, or to the upper room. Well, it is also really interesting that this is... The dome actually is burnt out in 1944. We'll be talking about it in a moment. But it's through use of country life photographs that they reconstruct the exact curve of the dome to rebuild it in the 1950s. So
proud moment.
A proud
country
moment.
Life folk, John.
But I mean, it is, you do think of places such as Clarendon now where they're not rebuilding, and you see the ambition with which in even the relatively recent past people have recreated things. And Castle Howard,
particularly after the war, can you imagine? Second World War.
And Castle Howard without its dome would be a sort of building, I hate to say it, but sort of almost emasculated. It wouldn't have any of the visual punch that it has today. And it's a testimony to I think it's George Howard who moved back into the house with his family and rebuilt it. I mean, it's an incredible undertaking to see that completion.
How would you describe the interior of Vanbrugh House? Cosy?
No. Do I was thinking that there's no coincidence that Lutyens so likes this kind of architecture, because I think exactly like Lutyens' architecture, and we'll talk about this in a moment, that Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor, of course, who assists him at Castle Howard, they create these wonderful set-piece spaces of movement where you're moving between rooms, but the rooms themselves are quite boring. And so
but they would have been terribly, terribly difficult to live in, wouldn't they? I mean, just simply through being so cold.
Yes, I think that is, it is true. And at Castle Howard, I think I'm right in saying that the Third Earl is actually very explicit that he doesn't want, cavernous living rooms, because he wants them to be, livable in. Yes. But of course, that does create a problem that the main space, which I think is, one of the great interiors of European architecture, when you walk into the building, almost one of the problems of the house has been that it doesn't have anything that, until now actually, anything that kind of counterbalances the sheer splendour of that impact.
It's rather like the opera house that Charles Garnier designed for Paris, which was designed so that it wasn't just the opera that you heard. You could, at the intervals and when you were going in, everybody looked up and down.
I could
see this sort of great social interaction of people going upstairs and going downstairs and through passages and things. And I think that buildings like Castle Howard have something of that quality. These spectacular views, not just along, but across and up and down. And imagine when you were right up at the top and you were looking down and possibly shouting to somebody who knew he was coming in through the front door. It's difficult to tell now because there's not that sort of life in them.
No, it's true. It is before we turn to the interior, because the most recent work has really focused on the interior, but it is worth just saying one or two more things about the landscape, because it is a completely extraordinary landscape. Not only does it have the pyramid we've spoken about and these walls that cross the landscape with towers that clearly are meant to evoke castle architecture, even if they aren't. But the two other buildings that are just of exceptional quality. One is the mausoleum, which dominates a hill some distance, about a mile distance from the house, which is again, mausolea are such a curious building type because they're not really, they are functional in the sense you bury people in them, but they are almost perfect architectural forms rather than functional architectural forms. And it sits in the landscape like a sort of fantastical vision of Claude Lorraine or something. It's like an architecturally perfect form commanding the landscape and there's beneath it, remember, there's a bridge with a river. It's really pretty. And then the other thing which is so marvellous is the Temple of the Four Winds at the end of the terrace, which preserves some of its original lead sculpture as you walk along the terrace. And as an interesting detail, just thinking about the sort of classical and medievalizing qualities of the architecture, is that you shouldn't walk up onto the platform around the Temple of the Four Winds, but if someone were generously to allow you to do so, and you look at the floor is actually an 18th century copy of the Cosmati pavement from Westminster Abbey.
Good heavens, how amazing. What an extraordinary thing.
And it is, I think it's...
You better explain what the Cosmati pavement is. Not
everyone will know. So the Cosmati pavement is this 13th century pavement laid by Henry III in Westminster Abbey, and it is the pavement on which the monarch, and Charles III, we've seen it most recently, is crowned. On this, it's an inlaid marble floor with 5 circular discs, and we know that in the 13th century it's made by these craftsmen brought in from Rome, though it's not important. It's a rich marble floor, and the coronation takes place on the central disc of the floor. So when you go to the Temple of the Winds, and as I say, if you ever are fortunate enough to be able to get inside, there is in fact a similar 5-panelled floor.
With this geometrical pattern, they thought it was Roman.
I'm sure they thought it was Roman, and I'm sure they knew that it had this resonance with Westminster Abbey. I mean, I'm sure both things are actually quite significant. So anyway, but it's a magical landscape.
Castle Howard would have had statues
on the building itself.
Does it along the sky?
Well, it has a panel. I seem to remember of Diana and the Hunt. I think I'm getting that right at one end of it. I mean, there is sculpture in the exterior. Of course,
they were like Baroque churches, weren't they? These houses, they were often ornamented in that way.
Externally.
With very lively skylines.
It has two very different frontages, of course, doesn't it? Because, I mean, I think it's the south front, which is overlooking the gardens and looks towards the pyramid, it's actually a very flat frontage. So the central block, which has this grand order of columns rising up, the wings are more or less flush with it. So it forms a kind of cliff-like frontage. And again, the main vista and axis runs right down the back of the house and doesn't actually land up in the house, if you see what I mean. It's just off axis. And then on the other side, of course, the wings sweep forward and create this very deep frontage which looks towards the lake. So it's they're but the central block also is very richly detailed and articulated, much more so than the side wings. So it's quite an interesting sort of hierarchy of ornament in the building.
I think I read that at the end of his life, the third Earl became quite grumpy, as many people do as they get older. And he was out of office, and he was he retreated to Castle Howard, and he was concentrating his creative efforts on the landscape, and he was living there with his unmarried daughters, who intensely resented being stuck in Yorkshire.
They wanted to be
having fun somewhere.
Well, it is.
Is that the case?
Well, he clearly does. I mean, he's clearly a sort of a creature of William III's government. It is interesting that he does. I mean, that he's MP for Morpeth, isn't he? I think in the early 1690s or something. But he isn't really very successful.
No.
Prior to
and the Howards really weren't very big cheeses, were they?
Well, I mean,
before he.
Well, he
was elevated.
Well, I'm about to say he isn't particularly, but he clearly gets in at court, and then
it's partly because he's building this donkey great house.
Indeed, and the house is going up as he begins to accrue.
Yes.
So instead of getting appointments and then building a house, this is all part of almost a gamble in which he,
very Kit Kat,
where you elevate yourself through what you're doing, and he does very, very well at that. But as is always the case, don't they say every political career ends in failure?
Yes,
and of course, it doesn't last. In 1715, pretty much with the death of Queen Anne, his political career pretty much comes to an end.
Not the great builder.
Though it is interesting. I mean, it's odd, isn't it? Because he's also a Whig. I don't know enough about him to know why it was that he simply didn't transfer his affections from, why he survived Queen Anne, who's very Tory in sympathy with their Tory governments, and why, when it became a Whig government again, he didn't succeed. But I'm sure it's all very personal.
Yes, stale buns, probably.
Yes.
And probably Walpole, I mean, he didn't want many rivals. He would have been... He would have been with the previous regime. Of course, he got into rather hot water. It had, as many of these grandees did, backing somebody who's virtually a pirate. That was one political issue that had to be overcome.
Well, I think...
But I don't think that's why he fell. Everybody was doing terrible things.
But, I mean, there's no getting away from the fact, is there, that this is a, really cutthroat political world, as it still is, and that the
people grabbed whatever they could
and
with both hands.
And the rewards were enormous, and defeat was total and catastrophic, often.
Yes. Should we touch on Brideshead Revisited?
Yes. Yeah, so no, you're right, because this is the film that made Castle Howard an internationally celebrated building.
And it's known to so many people as the emblem of that. And it must have been in Evelyn Waugh's mind. I think probably, just looking just now, and he visited in 1937. I was rather surprised. That was before the fire. I thought he would have visited at the end of the Second World War, after the fire, and he saw this place, which had been somewhere that he knew as a place of great splendour.
This is Evelyn Waugh.
Evelyn Waugh. And it... But he doesn't seem, we don't know that he went there after the Second World War, but he must have read about it.
But I've always
And of course,
imagined
it was
that
unforgettable. He would have loved it all.
he would have loved it all. But I always thought that Madrasfield was really the source.
Oh, it is, I think,
the source,
story.
the story. And Madrasfield just outside Great Malvern. But that indeed...
Where his great friends, the Ligon sisters, and indeed their brother... Hugh, was it? I think. I can't remember. Was that in the book? I can't quite remember. But anyway, the family, the story of the family whose father had gone to live abroad was that of Lord Beecham.
Of course,
their
it is.
father.
But I mean, the television series that was made in the 1980s, is sort of makes it synonymous. Makes the two synonymous, doesn't it? In the public,
so difficult
mind.
In a sense not to see somewhat through the eyes of that series to those of us who grew up with it. But now, John, with the refashioning, I suppose one could call it, a different Castle Howard is going to be presented to us, which you're going to tell us about.
In the next part of the podcast.
Very good.
Excellent.
John, I'm all ears. You've been to this great house, which has been... I can't remember. What word does one use? It's not just restored. It's a different thing. Recreated, reimagined.
Represented. So it was very exciting to see. And
Tell everybody.
And I also had the privilege of seeing it in the process of transformation. Just after the closure for the winter season of Castle Howard this year, everyone was running around trying to get the house ready for reopening and representation. And it's a really extraordinary and exciting undertaking in the sense that the house itself, they've taken the opportunity of a great deal of redecoration, but also the complete representation of the painting collection with designs by Alec Cobb, but almost the sort of central feature of it, and the thing that is so arresting, is the creation of a completely new room to the designs of the architect Francis Terry. Now, you need to understand everything that's gone on there. You need to understand that on November the 9th, 1944, I think that's the right date, there's when the house is requisitioned, I think for the Westonbirt Girls' School, there's a terrible fire that rips through the building. And it destroys...
Smoking in bed.
So who knows what was... Probably somebody does know what caused it. But it destroyed a very substantial section of the house, and including a whole body of rooms in the main block of the house and one of the wings. And some of those rooms are still, to this day, gutted shells. There's nothing in them. But... One of the rooms, what's called the tapestry room, was a shell until the beginning of this year. And it sits at a very important point in the sort of sequence of rooms, because it by recreating it, it allows there to be a complete circuit through the main hall of the house to the back of the house, and then round on the ground floor to the long gallery, or the gallery at one wing of the house. So it creates for the first time a proper visitor circuit through the building. But it's also really interesting because this particular room, the tapestry room, it's a series of Dutch tapestries which were made for Castle Howard, especially
when
made...
it was requisitioned, when the house was requisitioned, some of the contents have been taken out.
Some of the contents have been taken out, but it's even more complicated with these tapestries because they're commissioned for the house, I think, in 1706, and they're put up in this room, but they're very soon afterwards they're moved. They get moved all around the house at different points, and they do escape the fire. But it is known that they were created for this room. So when confronted by this shell, the idea was that you could bring the tapestries back in and then create a room around them, which would evoke the spirit of the Baroque originals. Now, it should be said that immediately after the fire, George Howard, he moves back in after the fire because, of course, he could have just said, I'm not moving back into this, eviscerated shell. And who knows what would then have happened to Castle Howard. But as it is, with a sort of heroic effort, he gets the dome back on and he rebuilds a roof over much the shell. And then I think it's the architect Julian Bicknell who he commissions in the 1980s on the back of the Evelyn Waugh television series, with money from that.
So much money from
I think they did very well from that. He commissions a series of rooms which are intended to be in the Baroque spirit. And what's happened most recently at Castle Howard is they've decided to extend this idea of working in a Baroque spirit to recreate the tapestry room. And it is really interesting because it is through and through. I mean, the quality of the craftsmanship is completely
what's it like? Give us a picture, apart from the fact it's got tapestries.
Tapestries. So the tapestries, of course, cover most of the wall space, but it has, as is appropriate for this period, and as the fabric preserved, there was a central fireplace on one side, which has been given a kind of cockle shell overmantel, partly inspired by the fireplace in the entrance hall of Castle Howard. And then there's this very, very deep cornice running around the room, very ornate cornice, which has been gilded. And the walls and the fireplace, the background colour is a kind of deep battleship grey.
Good heavens! I see. So that's unusual.
It's unusual, and it has with the gilding, it has an incredibly powerful impact actually. And having the tapestries, the evocation of the Baroque style is answered in the form of the tapestries. If you see what I mean, they speak to one another.
The kitchen we are sitting in now.
No,
You disappoint.
it could not. Anyway, everybody involved has done clearly an absolutely amazing job. But what's also fun is that it's not just that room. The rooms, all the different rooms and the picture hangers have been sort of refined. The emphasis for a modern visitor is on the house as a product of the Grand Tour. And there's a lot of material there gathered together by members of the Howard family through the Grand Tour. And as you see it today as a visitor, what you do is you enter up a 19th century the Grand Staircase, which has been, there were formerly portraits of the family in that space, and now there are plaster casts of antique sculpture which have been brought in and distempered.
Which were brought back historic to Castle.
No, they're new. These are actually newly purchased to create a sort of and they've been distempered to fit them into the room. So there's you walk in and there's all this classical sculpture around you, and then you walk through. In fact, the peculiarity of Castle Howard and the way it's designed, you walk through a series of bedrooms which have been redecorated very, very splendidly. One in particular had new silk put on and a spectacular bed in silk, but the walls are kind of yellow silk and the bed in crimson silk. It's absolutely magnificent. And then you walk through from that, if I'm getting this right, along a corridor to the entrance hall, which has to be one of the great spaces of European Baroque architecture, this underneath the dome, the central dome of the house. And in years gone by, it used to be the case that Castle Howard had this absolutely stupendous main entrance hall, but then it kind of aesthetically fell off a cliff because there was nothing, all the other rooms beyond it had been burnt out.
Yes.
Now, I do think that the tapestry room really begins to redress the balance. And I suppose one of the peculiarities of it is, as I understand it, there are no really good records of what that looked like in the early 18th century. We know a little bit about the form of it, but not very much. So it is, in many ways, a free recreation of an 18th century room. But it does create a sort of, give a flavour of that richness. And there is then, from then, a series of rooms, a dining room, a former dining room, I think the Reynolds room, and a room with Italian paintings in, which then connect to the Long Gallery, which is an altogether much later structure again. And the Long Gallery is again also being completely rehung and redecorated.
By the third Earl, was it Flitcroft who finished it off? I'm presuming in the age of the fourth Earl.
Flitcroft does some of it, but then there's also even later Carr does work. I mean, it's one of these things that goes on and on and on. And all these interiors...
And that gallery is sort of several rooms, isn't it?
It is quite peculiar.
Or gives the impression of being an unfolding...
Well, I think now it's...
like the Vatican.
Well, I was about to say that I was going to draw the parallel with Blenheim that has a very similar kind of library gallery, but they've reconfigured it and taken out bookshelves and things, and they've turned it into a picture gallery, and it's a very, very impressive and reintegrated series of spaces now, really. So the whole house feels quite different from, there's some elements of this that were done a few years ago, but most of it, the whole thing has been unveiled in this completely new room done this year. And the overarching effect with the rehang that's been done this year is really to give the whole house a totally different flavour from that which it had before.
It's very interesting, and this is something which could only be done by a private owner. It couldn't be done by the National Trust because they would be too constrained by having to do it in a style with reference to the past, whereas the family now can take these aesthetic decisions and do something which is, from what you say, very much in sympathy, but quite new.
I think you're absolutely right. They imbue it with integrity and authenticity because they are the family. They can take these decisions. Of course, it's been done. It must have been done with a great deal of labour to deal with historic England, and but nevertheless, the vision of the thing is transformative, and it is something that an organisation that looked after many properties and which had an institutional eye, I think would find it impossible to justify or deal with. You can just hear somebody saying, the gutted shell of the tapestry room is an important element in the history of this house and representative, an important stage in the history of the house, even though there are lots of other rooms that are still gutted shells.
Yes.
Somehow that would be a block to doing anything. And also, I have no idea what all this work has cost, but it's a major investment of time that I can't imagine many organisations would willingly take on without the drive and determination of the Howards as owners to take that forward.
Yes. It's also unusual, thinking, for example, of James Sturton's recent book about the heritage. One of his observations is that these days the focus has shifted. In the 80s, Brighted revisited that famous series that we mentioned before, there was a lot of focus on country houses, and there were lots of country houses. The darkest days when they were all being knocked down at such a rate had passed. A lot of things were being acquired by the National Trust. There was a lot of excitement. There were new sources of money for acquiring things. And practically every week there seemed to be a new Cork Abbey or whatever it might have been that was displayed in an interesting way, or Erdig or whatever. But those days are rather past. And these days the sort of focus of excitement has transferred to the outside and to things to do with landscapes and particularly rewilding, as it's called. Not a very good term in my opinion, but that's what the people who are working for the National Trust, that's what seems to excite them most now. They're looking at the environment. So for somebody to take this interior challenge and run with it in such a joyous way is really unusual.
Well, I also think that it's important to say, isn't it, that it's relatively easy to know what a reinvigorated landscape looks like. There are all kinds of ways in which you can empirically test whether you've restored a landscape successfully, biodiversity, all these different kinds of measures. There is no similar test for cultural restoration.
Yes.
Because there is no litmus test for what constitutes successful cultural restoration. Most people immediately just go to look at visitor figures. But of course, the irony is that not all properties want huge numbers of visitors. They can't sustain huge numbers of visitors.
Yes.
And I also think, when I talk to people about, the relative importance of gardens and parks versus houses, I say, well, in the case of the National Trust, if you were to take the square footage, the houses were still being much more intensively used per square foot than the gardens are and the landscapes and the parks are. So there's a sort of false analysis that somehow, because there are more people in parks and gardens, that the houses are somehow less important than those. But my argument would be that houses are the focus of these landscapes, and they are being very intensively used relative to their size. And of course, they've always been a drain on the financial resources of these estates. That's what they were built to be. They're a way of expressing excess. Yeah. And they're not made from the whey, they're made from the cream, if you know what I mean. And and to misunderstand that and to present these as a problem, I think is a terrible mistake. But also one other thing, just to say in that contrast too, I think it is wonderful that a family is able to do something in the spirit of a period, which is again something, as we've seen at Clarendon, the Trust cannot cope with the idea of recreating something in the spirit of a period. It just doesn't compute. They say it's somehow false. It lacks integrity. Although nearly all Western European architecture is imitative in some form. Apparently now
the nature of classicism is that it's always looking back to a golden age, which never probably existed. From the Greeks were looking back.
And the idea that somehow we can't do this anymore and it's somehow false to do it now, it seems to me genuinely incredible and extraordinary, a kind of intellectual somersault. But there are many different perspectives on this, and it's a contentious discussion in Clarendon. But I feel Castle Howard now does stand in a way as a challenge to the people working on Clarendon, because it seems to me you can do this kind of thing hugely successfully, and it's a different circumstance.
I suppose if we're going to continue this discussion with a comparison to Clarendon, there'd be less point at Clarendon. At Castle Howard there is a point because there's a family living there, not using the rooms every day, but it's a family seat. Whereas of course Clarendon isn't. It's owned by the National Trust.
No.
What's the point in spending all that money? I mean, in the old days, on the upper part was occupied by a porcelain collection, which was, assembled. It was the taste of the 1920s. Nobody looks at this porcelain and, looking at the difference between bow and
things are not
whatever it might be. People just don't do that. There's not the connoisseurship.
No, well, you're right.
Of course, we'd like their porcelain to continue to exist, which unfortunately was all destroyed.
It was all destroyed in the fire.
So I think it
is complicated, and you're right. And I suppose I would just come back to this point that I think it is really hard for an institution to compute what the Howards have done. But that may be at the heart of what we're talking about actually, is that for a family it makes sense, and for an institution it doesn't, because how do institutional decisions of this kind have integrity? I mean, it's designed by committee. How do you come to a solution? Whereas for the Howards, they can say, this is what we want, we're part of the history of this place, we're going to add to the history of this place. The Trust has taken the history of the place, and it's not... I don't want to make it sound critical, but it.
Oh, you are sounding rather critical.
How very unkind of me. But it's sort of bottling it up in the history.
Yes.
Up. It's not trying to be the history itself, though it is part of the history of it. The Trust is trying to bottle the history that's inherited. But here we have a family trying to continue the history. And I mean, I have seen photographs of the fire at Castle Howard and everything, but I mean, I would have thought overall it was pretty much quite as destructive as what happened at Clarendon.
Yes, and of course the temperature of the times were quite different, and it was much more difficult. I mean, after the Second World War, there was a prohibition on building, wasn't there, on private works? I think there's no money. There's no money in the country at all. So now we're a much richer country. There will be more money to spend if that was the decision that was taken. So I think that kudos to George Howard after the Second World War for having rebuilt the dome. One could imagine that there could be. It'd be very interesting to see what the National Trust does with Clarendon, because I've been up a couple of times actually and seen this ruined shell from the scaffolding in which it's encased, and it's very spectacular as a ruin. And you can imagine, I mean, these days, for example, Bankside Power Station has become Tate Modern.
Yeah.
Battersea Power Station, another example of a building which it seemed very unlikely would find a
new use.
A new use. And particularly in the case of Bankside, it's become a spectacular monument in its own right. Seems extraordinary. Well, you could do spectacular things with this ruin at Clarendon, and it remains to be seen
what will happen.
Whether that, I mean, I think to be fair to the National Trust, I think that for largely financial reasons they're stabilising it. It's not to say that it can't. I mean, it could go either way. It could go to a restoration at some future point, or it could go to some spectacular new reinterpretation, or it could just be left as it is. But,
they have had their plans.
Hasn't been closed.
Well, the plans have now gone, the planning permission has now been given. This is not really meant to be about Clarendon either. It's just quite an interesting comparison to bear in mind. What seems to me to have been achieved at Castle Howard is a complete refreshening of the interior of a building. And the whole point of that actually is not that it's the end, it's just another stage in the evolution of the house. And who knows, but maybe there are certainly other rooms that are waiting to be restored. And, wouldn't it be exciting if this is actually the first of a whole series of new rooms? I'm sure anything of that kind will take many, many years to come to pass. But it's just very exciting to see a house that had this one absolutely stupendous interior and the other principal rooms all as shells, now beginning to reacquire those other rooms. And
it's a great opportunity to have a shout out for the private owner.
It
because
is,
often now, it used to be that people walked and wandered around National Trust properties. I'm not knocking the National Trust in any shape or form, but that sense of wonder, the sense of sheer quality in every branch of the operation from the moment you go through the gates of the park, has rather transferred to places like Hatfield and Houghton and these great estates which are private.
And they're doing things that are of a quality and of an interest. This is certainly true of what's happened at Castle Howard.
Yes.
The quality of the workmanship in the new room, but also the quality of the workmanship in the new silks and other things, the painting and the decorations taking place in the other rooms is of such a high standard. And also the overview seems to me, I think it's important to acknowledge, the curator there, Christopher Ridgway, who's been a background figure to this, and the Howard's vision, and they've clearly shaped this very personal for them. But
and Christopher Ridgway, one of the great scholars of the period.
Indeed. And
of this house in particular.
And somehow the convergence of their engagement and knowledge and Christopher's knowledge and the teams that have been involved and it's almost like a great house has demanded great things of the people who are working on it, and they have responded in kind. It's a symphony of success.
What a wonderful vision you evoked, John, and what a great note for us to end on.
Excellent.
Thank you very much for this tour of this marvellous work. I can't wait to see it myself. So, John, there'll be another episode next week, and do we know what that's going to be?
Not yet.
Well, John and I do now know what we're going to be talking about next week, and that is the exuberant and colourful seaside development on the coast of North Wales, Port Merion, created in the first half of the 20th century by the equally colourful and exuberant Sir Clough Williams-Ellis, architect, conservationist, and an absolutely extraordinary and fascinating man. So do join us for that. If you liked our episode on Castle Howard, please feel free to leave a review with a star rating. 5 is very acceptable. Anyway, I do hope you'll join us next week.